The notice was 3 lines long. It had been tacked to the board outside the general store in Moose Jaw, half covered by a notice about a missing mule. She almost missed it. She almost walked past it the way she had walked past most things that winter, with her eyes forward and her hands in her pockets and her mind on nothing further than the next meal. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the word experienced. Maybe it was the word woman. Maybe it was just that the cold had been very bad that year and she was very tired of it, wanted. Experienced woman for work on timber claim north of Prince Albert. Cooking and general duties, lodging provided. Respond in writing to E. Calloway, Box 14, Prince Albert Post Office. She read it twice. Then she copied the address onto the inside of her wrist with a pencil stub and walked back to the room she was renting above the laundry. She did not know much about timber. She had grown up on a mixed farm outside of Portage la Prairie, wheat and hogs mostly. A few dairy cows her mother managed more or less on her own. She knew how to read a field, how to tell poor drainage from good by the color of the grass in August, how to fix a fence post when the ground was frozen and the mallet kept bouncing. She knew how to make something out of almost nothing in a kitchen. She did not know timber. But she was 31 years old and she had $52 to her name. And winter was not finished with her yet, and so she wrote the letter. The train north took the better part of 2 days. She watched the country change outside the window. The flat prairie giving way to aspen parkland, the aspen parkland giving way to spruce, the sky getting lower and grayer the further north she went. By the time she stepped off at the Prince Albert station, she could smell the cold off the river and off the trees, and something else underneath that she couldn't name yet. A man was waiting at the end of the platform. She knew it was him because he was the only one waiting, and because he looked like a man who had been waiting for a long time, not just that afternoon, but in general. He was older than she had expected. Not old, perhaps 45, but worn in the way that men who work alone in cold places get worn. His coat was good quality but badly mended. His boots were clean. He looked at her the way men in those situations always looked at women who answered advertisements, assessing and uncertain at the same time, as if they were trying to decide whether to feel relieved or disappointed. He said, "Are you the one who wrote from Moose Jaw?" She said she was. He said his name was Calloway. He said the wagon was out front. He did not ask her name, which she noticed. They drove north for 3 hours without speaking very much. He told her the claim was 60 acres of mixed spruce and jack pine on the east side of a creek that fed into the North Saskatchewan. He told her there was a cabin and a cook shed and a skidding barn. He told her the operation had been running for 4 years, but the last 2 years had been difficult. She asked what kind of difficult. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The kind where you keep falling behind." She looked at the trees going past on either side of the road. The spruce were close together and dark, and the snow between them was very white and very still. She thought about what falling behind meant on a timber claim. The contracts you couldn't fill, the equipment you couldn't repair, the men who stopped coming back in the spring. She asked if he had a crew. He said he had 1 man left, a Métis man named Tremblay who had been with him since the beginning and who was, as far as he could tell, the only reason the skidding barn still had a roof. She filed that away and did not ask anything else until they reached the claim. The cabin was small but tight. Someone had chinked it well. She could see it was recent work, and she suspected it was Tremblay's doing, not Calloway's. The cook shed was attached by a covered breezeway, which was practical. The stove in the cook shed's a good size and had been cleaned recently, which told her something. Tremblay was in the barn when they arrived. She met him briefly. A compact, quiet man in his 50s with careful eyes who looked at her without any particular expression and then went back to what he was doing with the harness he was mending. She noted the harness. It was old, but the stitching he was putting in was neat and deliberate. She noted that too. Calloway showed her the cabin and the cook shed. He showed her where the provisions were kept. He showed her the ledger book on the shelf above the small desk and told her that was where the contracts were recorded, and the expenses and the tallies from the cutting. He said the tallies had been off for 2 years. He said he didn't know why. She asked if she could look at the ledger. He said that wasn't what she was hired for. She said she understood that, but that night, After he had gone to sleep and Tremblay had retired to his quarters in the skidding barn, she took the ledger down and sat with it at the cookshed table by the light of the lamp, and she went through it from the first page. Took her most of the night. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, she had a reasonable picture of what had happened. The operation had been sound in its first 2 years. Good contracts with a mill in Prince Albert, consistent tallies, modest but real profit. Then in the 3rd year something had shifted. The tallies started dropping. Not dramatically, just enough, month by month, to put them behind. The expenses stayed the same. The contracts stayed the same. But the wood that was supposed to come out of the bush was not making it all the way to the mill. She put the ledger back exactly where it had been. She started the stove and made breakfast and said nothing. Tremblay ate at the table in the cookshed. Calloway ate there too, mostly in silence, which suited her fine. She was not there for conversation. She was there to understand things, and understanding things required quiet. In those first days she watched the way Calloway moved through the operation, which parts of it he paid attention to and which parts he seemed to avoid. She watched Tremblay, who was methodical and careful and who did not waste motion. She watched the skid trails that came out of the bush, the way the snow was packed on them, the tracks of the horses, the marks left by the logs as they came through. On the 4th day, she asked Calloway if she could walk the cutting site. He looked at her over his coffee cup. He said there was no reason for her to do that. She said she would like to see the timber she was cooking for. He thought about it for a moment, and then he said she could go with Tremblay in the morning, and not to get in the way. She did not get in the way. She walked behind Tremblay for most of the morning, and she watched where he looked and what he did, and she looked at the trees and the ground, and the skid trails and the creek that ran along the northern edge of the cutting block. In the afternoon, while Tremblay was working, she followed the creek upstream for about a 1/4 mile. What she found was not complicated. A beaver dam had gone in the previous summer, backing water up into the low ground on the east side of the cutting block. The water had not risen enough to flood anything dramatically. It was subtle, a matter of inches, but it had softened the ground on the main skid trail where it crossed the low area. Every time a load of logs came through on that trail, the horses were losing their footing in the soft ground. The loads were getting hung up, sliding sideways, losing logs into the brush and the shallow water at the edge of the trail. The men were recovering what they could, but not all of it. Some of it had been buried under subsequent loads that slipped. Some of it had been written off quietly because it was easier than explaining it. She stood at the beaver dam for a long time in the cold, looking at it. It was not sabotage. It was not theft. It was just a beaver that had decided to build a dam, and a skid trail that had been routed wrong to begin with, and 2 years of small losses adding up to a large problem. She walked back to camp. At supper, she put a plate of salt pork and beans in front of Calloway, and she said, "There's a beaver dam on the creek, about a 1/4 mile up from where your main trail crosses the low ground." He looked up from his plate. She told him what she had found. She told him what she thought it had cost him over 2 years. She did not tell him how she knew to look for it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tremblay never said anything." She said she didn't think Tremblay knew. She thought the men who'd been on the trail had known something was wrong, but hadn't tracked it back. He pushed his plate away. Not because the food was bad. She could see he was just thinking, and eating required too much of him at the moment. He said, "If we rerouted the trail around the low ground," she said, "you'd add about 200 yards, but you'd be on solid ground the whole way. And the dam needs to come out, or it'll just back up further." He looked at her. She said, "I grew up on a farm. We had drainage problems. You learn to read water." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he picked up his fork and finished his supper. Tremblay took out the dam the following week. It was not a small job. The beaver had been thorough. But Tremblay was good with an axe and patient with the cold water, and he did not complain about it. She watched from the bank the first day, and then on the second day she waded in alongside him without being asked, and they finished it together in the afternoon. She was very cold afterward. She went back to the cookshed and changed her clothes and stoked the stove high and made tea and sat with her hands around the cup until the feeling came back to her feet. Tremblay came in an hour later. He poured himself tea and sat across from her, and they drank in silence for a while, which was the most comfortable conversation she had yet had on the claim. After a time, he said, in the careful English he used when he was being precise, "The trail reroute will take most of a week. The ground is good where we'll be going." She said that was what she had thought. He said he should have had someone looking at the operation as a whole, not just the cutting. She said she supposed that was true. He looked at his tea. He said, "You're not just here to cook." She said she was very much here to cook. She said supper would be at 6. He smiled just slightly and finished his tea and went back out. Spring came slowly and with a great deal of mud. She had expected the mud. Everything about the north came with mud in spring, but the quantity of it was still instructive. The rerouted trail held. She walked it the first week of April to see for herself, and the footing was solid the whole way, and the logs came through without incident, and the tallies for March were the best in 2 years. Calloway showed her the March tally without comment. He set the ledger book open on the cookshed table and put his finger on the number and looked at it and then looked at her. She said, "April should be similar, maybe better once the ground firms." He said, "It's not just the trail." She waited. He said, "The contracts with the Prince Albert Mill, therefore a standard dimension lumber. What I've been cutting doesn't all fit that. Some of the spruce in the North Block runs bigger than the contract specs. I've been cutting it down to fit and wasting a lot of good wood." She said, "Is there a buyer for the bigger dimension?" He said he had thought there might be a buyer in Saskatoon, a construction operation that was doing large commercial buildings, but he hadn't pursued it because he hadn't had time. She said, "I'll look at the contracts and see what needs to change." He said, "I told you before." "That's not." She said, "I know what you told me." He looked at her for a long moment. The light in the cook shed was the flat white light of early spring through a small window, and it was not a flattering light, and she didn't care. He said, "Do you know contract law?" She said she didn't. She said she knew how to read and how to reason and how to ask a clear question, and that was usually enough to know when a contract needed a lawyer and when it didn't. He pushed the ledger across the table to her. She pulled it toward her and opened it to the contract section and began to read. She had been on the claim for 5 months when Tremblay's younger brother arrived looking for work. His name was Gilles, and he was 23 and strong and not particularly experienced in timber work, but willing to learn. She watched Calloway hesitate over the decision. The operation was improving, but money was still tight, and she said nothing because it was his decision and not hers. He hired Gilles. It was the right decision. Gilles was quick to learn, and he worked without complaint, and he had his brother's quality of quiet usefulness. By July, there were 2 other men as well. A pair of brothers named McPherson from the Battleford area who had heard through some chain of northern communication that the Calloway claim was hiring again. She cooked for 5 men that summer, and she kept the ledger, and she corresponded with the Saskatoon buyer on Calloway's behalf, drafting letters for him to review and send. And she walked the cutting block once a week to see what she could see. What she saw mostly was that the timber was better than he thought it was. Not just in volume, in quality. The spruce in the North Block was old growth in places, slow-grown and tight-ringed, the kind of wood that builders wanted for structural work. She started keeping a separate tally of it, marking which logs came from which part of the block. And the Saskatoon buyer began requesting it specifically. She showed Calloway the separate tally in August. She showed him what the North Block wood was bringing per board foot compared to the standard contract. He sat with it for a while. He said, "My father bought this claim in 1891. He logged the South Block and went back to Ontario and never came back. I came up in 1909 to see what was left." She said, "The North Block hasn't been touched." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you know how many acres are in it?" He said he thought about 30. She said, "I think it's closer to 45. The survey stakes on the northeast corner are wrong. The claim runs further than your map shows." He looked at her. She said she had walked the corner the previous week and found the original stakes from the 1891 survey. She said the northeast stake was 50 yards north of where his current map put it. He said, "That's not a small error." She said, "No." He was quiet. Then he said, "If the claim runs further," she said, "you'd want a surveyor to confirm it." But yes, it would change the timber estimate considerably. The surveyor came in September. She was not present for his work, but she saw his face when he came back to the cabin in the afternoon, and she had learned enough about the claim by then to read the meaning in it before he said a word. The claim was 68 acres, not 60. The North Block alone was larger than the entire operation. Callaway had been running for 4 years. The surveyor confirmed the original stakes and filed the amended survey with the land office in Prince Albert. She copied the amended figures into the ledger in her own hand in pencil and wrote the date beside them. Callaway came and stood in the doorway of the cook shed that evening while she was cleaning up after supper. He stood there without saying anything for long enough that she turned around. He said, "Why did you walk the corner?" She said she'd been walking that boundaries a section at a time since May. She said she liked to know the shape of a thing. He said, "Most people who come up here to work on a claim don't walk the boundaries." She said she supposed that was true. He said, "Tremblay said you waded into the creek with him. He said you knew before you got in what needed doing." She said Tremblay was generous. He said, "He's not generous, he's accurate. He doesn't say things that aren't true." She had nothing to say to that, so she turned back to the stove and finished what she was doing. He said from the doorway, "I didn't ask your name at the station. I've been thinking about that." She told him her name. He said it back once carefully, as if he was filing it in the right place. Then he said goodnight and went back to the cabin. The winter that followed was different from the one before it. She felt the difference in the work, in the way the men moved through the days with a kind of steadiness that had not been there before, in the way the logs came out of the North Block clean and on schedule, in the way the tallies matched the contracts for the first time since the operation began. She felt it in other ways too, small ways. The way Callaway left the ledger out on the desk instead of putting it back on the shelf. The way he began asking her opinion on things before he decided them, not as a formality but in the way that people ask when they actually want to know. The way he fixed the latch on the cook shed door without being asked in December when the cold had made it difficult to open. She did not make more of these things than they were. She had learned over the years that small gestures were only meaningful when they accumulated, and she had learned to wait and see what they accumulated into. What she was sure of was the work. The work was real and it was hers, and she understood it now in the way she had not when she first stepped off the train at Prince Albert. Not just the cooking and the ledger keeping, but the timber itself. The way the North Block held its cold differently than the South Block. The way the creek ran under the ice in February. The way the spruce sounded in a high wind at night, a sound like breathing. In February, a letter came from the Prince Albert mill, offering to renegotiate the contract. They had heard, through whatever channels mills used to hear things, that the Callaway claim was producing old-growth spruce of a quality not commonly available in the region. They wanted first right of refusal on the North Block timber at a premium rate. She read the letter twice and then put it on Callaway's desk. He read it that evening. He came to the cook shed afterward and sat down at the table, and she poured him coffee and sat across from him. He said, "They're offering 30% above the standard rate." She said, "The Saskatoon buyer will go higher. You should write back to Prince Albert and tell them you have another offer." He said, "I don't have another offer yet." She said, "Write to Saskatoon first." He looked at her over his coffee. She said, "The mill knows what they have access to and what they don't. They made this offer because they're worried about losing the account. That means they'll go higher." He said, "You think so?" She said, "I think the North Block timber is worth more than they've offered and they know it, and they'd rather pay a little more than lose it to Saskatoon." He thought about it. Then he said, "Write the Saskatoon letter. I'll look at it tomorrow." She wrote it that night, after supper, at the cook shed table, with the lamp turned up high. She wrote it carefully and revised it twice, and then read it again in the morning with fresh eyes and changed one sentence. He read it and changed nothing, and signed it and sent it. The Saskatoon buyer offered 40% above standard rate for first access to the North Block timber for the following 3 years. She entered the figure in the ledger. She entered it in the column where she had been tracking the North Block separately, and she drew a line under it, and then she added up the column and wrote the total at the bottom. She looked at the total for a while. Then she found the page from the first year of the operation. The year Calloway's father had filed the claim. The year the spruce was just standing trees and the cabin was just a plan on paper. And she put the two pages side by side. The difference between them was not just money. The difference between them was years of work and 2 beaver dams worth of bad luck and 1 rerouted skid trail and 45 acres of old-growth spruce that no one had thought to walk to the corner of. She closed the ledger. Outside, she could hear Tremblay and Gilles working on the equipment shed, the sound of hammers in the cold air, steady and unhurried. The McPherson brothers were on the north block. Calloway was somewhere between the cabin and the skid trail, which was where he was most mornings now. Not avoiding the operation, but moving through it differently, the way a man moves through something he has stopped being afraid of. She put the ledger back on the desk. Beside it was the original notice from the Moose Jaw General Store. She had carried it with her without quite knowing why, folded into the inside pocket of her coat since November, then set on the desk one evening when she was looking for a piece of paper and never put away again. It was soft at the folds now, the pencil copy of the address on the back long smudged, experienced woman. General duties, lodging provided. She had been experienced. The duties had turned out to be more general than advertised in one direction or another. The lodging was adequate and warm. She left the notice on the desk and went to start the noon meal.